Hi, A-Push. It's Mrs. Zimnick. I am going to walk you through one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is the civil rights movement, excuse me, from the 1950s all the way till today. So, this is a topic that we are obviously still kind of focused on. We still see this sort of what I always call kind of this is one of our ghosts of the American Revolution that's still left over here. I'm going to break this into two parts. So, the first part is we're going to take you up to the Brown decision. And then the second part, I'll probably take you from Brown to around 1968. And then part three will take you from about 1968 to as close to today as we can get. So, this is a great topic that the A-Push exam always likes to focus on because it is one of those themes that goes all the way through US history. So, for all intents and purposes, you already know that the struggle for civil rights began the first day that people who were enslaved were brought to this country against their will, which is 1619 in Jamestown. Okay. We're going to start right around the end of the Civil War, and I'm just going to do kind of a brief review here and take you right up to the Brown decision. Then I really want us to dive into that Brown decision and see what that really does. And then we're going to see how I always say that should be the end of the civil rights movement. Case closed. Drop the mic, right? Separate but equals not okay. What we're going to see is that's really the beginning of what we know when we think civil rights movement. You probably think 1950s and 60s, okay? So the Brown case is really the big trigger for what most Americans probably associate with the civil rights movement. You know better than that. You know this started long before 1954. So let's go back to 1868 here and take a look at that 14th Amendment. And you can see the wording of this amendment, and hopefully you remember going back into period 5 and period 6, that this is to really give birthright citizenship to everyone born in the United States, so granting citizenship to all formerly enslaved persons, and then also to give due process. And this is a big term. You'll hear lots about this in government next year. Due process is the idea that nobody can take away your life, your liberty, or your stuff without a fair trial. Okay. So again, this should have been the end, right? We have it in place. We should have had the ability to vote. We should have had the ability to have your life and your liberty without worrying about an angry mob showing up at your house to murder you or your family. But as you guys know, that is not what happens. So this amendment is there, and it is, I think, probably the most important amendment in the Constitution, but it will be largely ignored for a long time. So we start with that. Okay. Now we go to a little bit later. Now we're in the Gilded Age, and we take a look at that Plessy case. And hopefully you're kind of seeing, we've been reviewing this a little bit, but that Plessy case was really established the so-called doctrine of separate but equal, which of course, as you know, is garbage. It never was equal. And this really legalizes Jim Crow laws. So you can see this is the statement from the majority opinion, where it's saying, look, the 14th Amendment is supposed to do absolute equality, but it's not intending to get rid of distinctions. It's okay to say one's different than the other. That's not saying one's better. That's okay, right? So you can hear them justifying this decision. And Justice Harlan's dissent is just on fire. It's great. He calls out what we know. He says, look, the Constitution is colorblind, and this decision is a huge mistake. So this will establish the Jim Crow era, which will go until the Brown decision. So we've got Up from Slavery, and we've got Booker T. Washington, and he's talking about, and W.B. Du Bois. And they are two Black leaders at the turn of the century with very different ideas. We know Washington gave his Atlanta Compromise speech. We know Du Bois really challenges him with Souls of Black Folk, where he really calls out the idea of waiting, right? And then we see the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, aka the NAACP. And this is founded in the Niagara movement. You can kind of see Niagara Falls. Upstate New York has been kind of a real area where there's been consistently, even before the Civil War, a lot of movement for free speech, equality, voting rights. It's where Seneca Falls, New York is another place that comes to mind. So you see Rochester, Seneca Falls, and the Niagara movement really pushing, because as you guys know, the progressives were failing on race. They were not able to really get much accomplished. So we know that in the teens and 20s, it was not safe to be African American. So we know that lynching was happening. We talked about Ida Wells and her efforts to try to expose the horrific nature of lynching. The Rosewood Massacre effectively ruined an entire community in Florida, and drove African Americans out of that. And so what we're seeing here is that a lot of times law enforcement was tacitly involved or looking the other way or even actively involved in a lot of these things. Okay, another slide that I don't have here, but we talked a lot about in class was the Tulsa race riot in 1920, the massacre, because that's what it was, of Black Wall Street, 1921. And so these things are happening, and we're not seeing any federal action. Okay, because we're not seeing any federal action, the states are really left to themselves. So there's this idea that the states can do whatever they want. I mean, it's up to the states. Ninth and 10th Amendment. You guys, it's the same argument we heard before the Civil War. So you're going to hear those arguments being brought up consistently throughout this. Scottsboro boys are another, oh boy, you want to be frustrated. I will link to a story where these boys were falsely accused of a rape. And later on, the girls who accused them recanted their story, took it all back, but it still didn't matter. And so this is another one that happens where you can just see that the justice system was really not colorblind at all. It was very much against African Americans. Again, juries are often pulled from eligible voters. Well, as we know in the South, the voting rolls had effectively been purged of African American voters. They were unable to vote. So if you're unable to vote, you're unable to sit on a jury. So if you're supposed to be guaranteed a fair trial by jury with a jury of your peers, that is very clearly not happening in the United States in many regions prior to the 1950s or 60s. Executive Order 8802. Now, we're getting some baby steps, okay? This is a baby step. We talked about FDR was very hesitant. He did not desegregate the troops, despite the fact that his wife, Eleanor, was pushing him on that. He did not do that. But he did do this. And this was under the threat of A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington. And Randolph said, look, I'm going to have a march on Washington. I'm going to call out the hypocrisy of us going to war to fight a war to end racism with segregation in this country. And so this is FDR's sort of concession. And he desegregates federal agencies during the war. He's not going as far as to desegregate the troops. It won't be until Harry Truman that does that. But it's a step. We also see during World War II, the Congress on Racial Equality formed. We see James Farmer and George Hauser, two kind of founding fathers here of this particular group. And so we're going to start to see even some white allies joining the cause here. But at this point, it's definitely still pushed mostly by African Americans. And this is part of that greater double V campaign that we discussed a lot when we were looking at World War II, the idea of two victories, a victory over racism overseas and a victory over racism at home. Okay, sports are a litmus test. This isn't just because I love baseball, although I do. 42, amazing movie. And boy, does Harrison Ford look just like him, right? If you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. So Jackie Robinson is the first one to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And he does this in 1947. And I'll post a link to the trailer for 42. Oh, if you are stuck at home, as we all are right now, and you need something to watch, I highly recommend this movie. It's great. But it's not just because of the baseball aspect of it. It's also because of just the bravery that Jackie Robinson exhibited, just the grace and the humility and how hard it was for him when even his own teammates, even his own fans were saying horrific racial slurs at him. So another fun fact is Larry Doby broke the color barrier in the American League. So Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. That's the National League. And that is, of course, the first person in the major leagues to do it. But a few months later, July 5th, 1947, I know that because that's my birthday, July 5th, 1947, Larry Doby broke the color barrier in the American League. And next time you go catch an Indians game, look on the back, kind of towards right field where they have retired all the numbers, and you'll see Larry Doby's number is retired. Not just because of that, but also because he was a phenomenal player. So sports are going to continue to be representative of us. And I would argue they still are today. I mean, look at what's happening with Colin Kaepernick. Look at the women's national soccer team as being sort of a litmus test of broader issues happening. So the integration of the armed forces, this is Harry Truman. Executive order, again, it's another executive order, 9981, that desegregates our armed forces. And finally now, Black soldiers and white soldiers are allowed to serve side by side and be paid the same. That's another thing. So Black soldiers have been playing a role, folks, ever since the Revolutionary War. They have played a role in every single war. They've been on every single battlefield. But in segregated troops or pushed to the side to menial tasks. And now they will, of course, be able to serve alongside and serve as they always had, serve bravely and with honor. So the Korean War is the first war we'll really see that happening. Now we get to the Brown versus Board decision. Okay, so now it's 1954. The Korean War has just ended. And what we're going to see is Linda Brown lived in Topeka, Kansas, and because of the separate but equal laws, was forced to go to the school that was on the other side of town when there was a whites only school very close to home. And so her parents had sued. Now, we want to recognize, though, is Linda Brown is not the first one to file suit. This had been a slow, steady climb. They actually started with colleges first. And so they start with colleges and trying to prove that there's an unfair burden at the college level. And once they're able to do that with a few cases, then they start challenging elementary schools because they know they need to set a precedent here, right? So this is a real coordinated effort by the NAACP. And this is where I'm going to pause this video because what we're going to see is you guys look at the majority opinion, which, by the way, was unanimous. And it's Earl Warren that issues that unanimous decision that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. What does that mean? That means because you separate it, it is unequal. Even if it is quote unquote equal. This is where I say, think about my desks in the room. Even if all those desks are the same, which they are, right? They're the same desk. If I say you can't sit in this one here, you can sit everywhere else you want, but not this one. I've made that desk unequal. By separating, we make it unequal. And then the fact of the matter is, as you know, these were never equal to begin with, right? Consistently, and this is what was brought up in the trial, Black schools had less resources, less teacher training, all kinds of overcrowding issues, right? No running water. I mean, it was comical that anyone ever thought these were equal to begin with. But the Supreme Court makes it very clear, and they wanted it to be unanimous, folks, because they didn't want the door to be open for any arguing. So they issued this unanimous decision, and this should be the end, right? That's it. Separate but equals wrong. It should be, but it's not. Okay, and why isn't it? Because we're going to start to see some state representatives say, we don't care. We don't care what the Supreme Court says. Make me desegregate, right? We've heard this before, haven't we? Think Andrew Jackson, Indian removal, right? Think Worcester versus Georgia. Think Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And what did Jackson do? Jackson goes, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I'm doing it anyway, right? We have every single Southern member of Congress signed something called the Southern Manifesto, where they basically said the Supreme Court has overstepped their bounds, and that is not okay. And we're going to exercise our state's rights to ignore the Supreme Court. These three men refused to sign. And I bet you know these two names. You might not have heard of Estes Kefauver, but shout out to him. High five, right? Al Gore Sr. of Tennessee. His son, Al Gore Jr., will be our future vice president and the presidential candidate in the election of 2000. And then Lyndon Johnson, a previous, he was a school teacher from Texas. He had a lot of impoverished kids in his classroom. His heart really went out to students that were suffering with poverty. And he really just disagreed with that. He said, I can't sign this. So there are going to start to be some that recognize that. But we're going to see the states dig in, you guys. And we're going to see that Eisenhower is really slow to respond. So if we look at this political cartoon, here's Uncle Sam. Here's Eisenhower, right? It says chief. Can you tell what he's wearing? This is a fireman's outfit, okay? And we see out here civil rights crisis, and it's in flames. It's burning. And the caption of this is, somebody should do something about that, right? So this is a great cartoonist that we're going to see so many of his cartoons. I mean, he drew from the 1950s all the way through the 1980s, and his name was Herbert Block, but he went by Herblock. Awesome political cartoonist. And he just nails it here. He just nails it because what we're going to see is the states are going to push back. And really, prior to 1957, we're not going to see, it's going to be crickets coming from the White House because Eisenhower is going to be a little hesitant to touch this in his defense, as any president before him had, right? But we're going to start to see that change once we get to Little Rock. And once we get to that, we'll see Eisenhower say, enough is enough, and I'm going to act. I'm going to send federal troops. Okay, so this takes us through just the very beginning, a little bit of a review here. I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to get into my next video here. We'll take you through the rest. All right, I have to figure out how to stop it. I lost my, oh, there it is. Stop sharing. All right, so I will pause here and see you in a minute.